Okay, it's on 5G and network innovation. It's sponsored by Digital Catapult and Huawei, and it's delivered on behalf of UK 5G. So to introduce all of the speakers, I would like to hand over to Simon Fletcher.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Now, actually, debates may be a bit strong. I mean, we've got four good speakers here, and we'll get differing views. What we wanted to do here, I've stood on this stage and on previous stages. In fact, the first time I introduced a 5G debate for FWIC, the predecessor to QUIC, was in 2015 at Emirates. And the question that we were debating in the final session was, do we need 5G? And the crowd, in the end, said no. You know, that's typical of a Cambridge crowd, I guess, even though we were in London, so we tried to bias it. But anyway, here we are a few years later, and 5G is still on the horizon. And I guess 5G now, for a lot of people in the industry, is an exercise in constructive ambiguity, we could say. It allows a lot of innovations to be discussed, and it's quite an interesting prospect potentially. But what we are seeing is, you know, a lot of discussion around various use cases, and the industry is agile enough to say, oh, that looks quite interesting, and actually I could do that with 4G now, so if there really is a demand, I'll just press on. I don't need to wait for 5G to be formally announced. So this ambiguation of standards and technologies and what 5G is versus 4G is going to continue for some time. But here we'd really like to just look at, from different speakers' perspectives, try and get a feel for what they think are the real nuggets or things that are actually happening rather than just the hype. So bearing in mind that the slide we saw from the Gartner presentation said that we're still in the innovation trigger phase for 5G. There's obviously a lot of opportunity there for us to explore what those innovations may be. So let's get on with that. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, Dritan, who will give us his first perspective.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is, as you can read, Dritan Kaleshi, and I'm a lead technologist for Future Networks and a 5G fellow at Digital Catapult, where I lead the 5G program of work. I don't know, it is either very, very smart or not so smart to have this particular session right at the very end of the day, where most of the questions in the first session was about 5G. So to open and close with 5G is quite interesting. For the next 7.5 minutes, I want to really sort of cover 3 topics for discussion and leave them then open for questions from you and the other panelists. First one is that our view is that 5G represents a very significant opportunity for the digitalization of the economic activities, and that is the particular thing that makes 5G so special. It is an opportunity, so converting that opportunity into something real is really the debate that is going on, and where the constructive ambiguity that Simon mentioned comes into play. And the question is, do we pick it early or later in the next 10 years that 5G will take hold? The second point that I want to make is that 5G is special because its use as a technology cannot be delivered anymore solely by the mobile industry ecosystem on its own, as it has happened in the previous generations. And the third point is that there is a strong need for coordinated, market-driven but coordinated innovation activities in the UK for the UK to take advantage of the 5G. By way of introduction, for those of you that don't know, Digital Catapult is an advanced technology innovation center set up by the government about 4.5 years ago, a not-for-profit commercial organization with a single mission to effectively accelerate the early adoption of advanced digital technologies across the UK in ways that deliver economic impact and improvement on productivity. We have a very active program on 5G with several projects. We even have our own 5G testbed for all things, and we can have a discussion on how that is going. But that has made us look for the past 4 years continuously what makes 5G sort of special. And we know that the mobile industry has been particularly and spectacularly successful in building a clear ambition for 5G as an enabler for digital transformation. And at the moment, the discussion on hype is almost as if the mobile industry itself is taken a bit aback from other people jumping on the same bandwagon that they have built and saying, well, hold on, you are taking this in slightly different directions. Or are we? So if we look at the evolution of the mobile technologies over the past 30 years, the previous generations, those are very, very clear market step changes, evolutionary step changes, which appear to the user to be very evolutionary. So we were able as users of mobile phones to make calls everywhere in the world, use data, internet everywhere in the world. And then with 4G, we were able to use a bit more data and a bit more faster, almost everywhere in the world, but pretty much everywhere. And with 5G, we are promised that this will be slightly better and slightly different. But from a consumer perspective, it is not very clear from the user's perspective. What we tend to forget as a community here, as well as elsewhere, and it is very, very surprising sometimes because the community is quite involved in the underpinning technologies, is that we don't necessarily reflect how innovative the mobile industry itself has been in actually providing fantastic technology, fundamental technology changes in each generation of the mobile technology, effectively reinventing itself technologically every 10 years. For market purposes or otherwise, you have this generational mark. But there are hardly any other technologies that effectively do the same thing. And now, the point is, whilst doing that, they have been hugely successful. So I was a bit taken aback in the previous session, and I hope that the people are still here, so I'm not talking behind their backs, when IoT and 5G will put in the same bucket as a hype and away from AI. Mobile industry generates $3.6 trillion of GDP in the world. It's 4.6% of the world GDP. So it is not a hype, it is something that exists, on top of which we effectively do and modify and build businesses around the world. So where is the 5G that it is effectively different? And there are two elements on that. There is a fundamental technology transformation, which is the fact that for the first time, by design, we have the ability in 5G that we'll see developing over the next 3 years, 3 to 5 years, that we have a combination of computation, storage, and communication in one single infrastructure. And that will happen by design, and it is the first mobile technology that offers this. And the second thing is also by design and requirement that mobile communication systems for the first time will connect more things than people. And things have very different requirements in terms of they are a lot less flexible than people are. And with this thing, we are looking that this evolution of the technology now is, it is a very, very broad choice that a lot of things are possible, but the mobile industry is effectively asking and continually opening the discussion. Again, borrowing from what Simon said earlier on this, what was the ambiguity? Constructive ambiguity. Asking and saying, okay, which kind of technology there is a need in the market because we can develop, we can deploy that, and there are certain market models that need to be developed. However, without this cross innovation element, it is going to be next to impossible for these opportunities to effectively be explored. And this is the second point that we effectively, that I wanted to say. In order for 5G to deliver against this ambition, we always say that there are, like any other technology, but with less regulation, there are 4 key ingredients and components. So it is typically a market need, which needs to be matched with some technology capability that delivers, can meet that particular market need. And that matching happens through some kind of innovation process. And innovation is one of the words that has been used today very, very frequently, and together with security and interoperability is one of the most misused words in my experience over the past 25 years. And that misuse includes me as well. I'm not excluding myself from that criticism. We need to be very, very clear on what that cross-innovation is and why is that particularly important, and most importantly, on picking the right people that can deliver those things. Innovation is quite a challenging thing to do properly. So if we look across all of this, the market need is there. The numbers are absolutely astonishing, from $12 trillion by 2035 to $560 billion in euro by 2026. However, the technology capability is there. As of June the 15th, we have a very definite 5G is real. The release 15 has been launched. So enhanced mobile broadband, vendors can effectively sell standards compliant equipment, and network operators or similar organization to network operators can deploy systems that are, again, standards compliant. 5G is real. 5G is here. What we are missing is that cross-pollination. And very, very quickly, where is the UK in matching between this market need, technology capability, cross-innovation activities, as well as the regulatory framework? That it's very, very important, but I don't have enough time to touch upon it. Digital Catapult issued a report, and there will be some copies from colleagues of mine that are in the room, that if you can take home as a memento, frame them up, of course. We have done that. Which effectively looks at the 5G UK ecosystem as to what it is doing, who is doing what on 5G in the UK. And very briefly, the findings there are not extremely surprising. They are very, very positive. There is a very strong and growing UK ecosystem in the UK, very strong academic underpinning of the 5G activities, more than 225 projects in local authorities, industry, and academia. What is particularly surprising, though, is that less than 1% of the total funding going into that is about innovation. So we know how to develop technology. We probably call the technology development innovation, but innovation is not properly done until you have a product that it is effectively delivered in the end. So going forward, our proposition for the panel today, or for the discussion here, is that delivering 5G successfully over the next 2 to 5 years, because it's a continuous delivery. It's not like you open a shop and Apple 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, Samsung 9 comes in. To deliver 5G successfully over the next 2 to 5 years means to deliver a commercially viable infrastructure, but which the UK also has an ambition that this particular infrastructure can support economic growth to the benefit of everyone. And that is that combination of a commercially viable output combined with socioeconomic targets and objectives is very difficult to effectively balance. And from the report, we can say that the UK appears to have decided on a market, on the fact that deployment will be driven by demand for 5G. So that makes the innovation process in this particular space over the next 2 to 4 years particularly important in terms of generating the demand, testing what the particular market models will be, and building the time and the space and the environments where these things can effectively be tested. The second thing is that, welcomed as the government intervention is for 5G, underpinning 5G with the £200 million 5G testbeds and trials program, welcomed as it is not the only thing that effectively can answer the market needs. If these market needs are real, so they can act, and they are acting, and they are acknowledged to be acting as a starter engine, but it is also the time for the industry in the UK to effectively be clear if they genuinely believe that there is particular market opportunities that they need to be addressed, and they need to actually explore and be ready to, or willing to experiment and explore this commercially with or without public funding. 4G and 5G will coexist for a very long time, and that is positive for us because that means that we can de-risk innovation. A lot of the things that can effectively, that require 5G can be delivered up to a certain level over 4G. That should allow us to effectively identify points where over the next 2 to 4 years, 5G will be necessary for the digital transformation of the industries in the same way that 4G delivered the social transformation, digital transformation of our social lives, independently if we like that or not. And final note is, yes, it is exciting to be in this space, both personally and organizationally, but at the same time, we need to understand that this is serious business and mature industry and mature industries interacting with it together. And we need to be realistic and purposeful in our direction that we want to go with the 5G innovation. And for that, in the market-led innovation space, we would be very keen to work with everyone in the ecosystem to develop that together. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, excellent. Thank you, Dritan. Next speaker is from Nokia, and thank you, Anne, for coming all the way over from Helsinki today, or yesterday evening. And you're welcome, please.
Hello and good afternoon also from my side, and I'm happy to be here today. So my presentation is done on behalf of Global Suppliers Association, GSA, which has a spectrum group. It was created in order to lobby spectrum for 5G especially. The board members are listed here in the bottom of the slide. My presentation is really, I think, beyond all hype, and I try to describe where we are right now. This is the triangle that has been shown already earlier today. So it basically shows these new capabilities that we think that 5G will bring. So there will be this enhanced mobile broadband, this extra high-speed data which will be available. Then ultra reliable and low latency is one of the key characteristics. And then massive machine-type communication. And we expect that there is a really millions or milliards of IoTs connected in the future. And the idea of 5G is that one network infrastructure can cope with all of those new features. In today's speeches, we have noticed a lot of innovation and ideas that what will happen, but actually very few of them contain any of these 5G capabilities. They can be quite well implemented using LTE and 4G. But the idea is that the 5G technology, which will be a new radio interface after LTE, so that will provide this a platform for new innovations, and maybe it can boost technology and services and new use cases to happen. But technology as such is only technology, and it provides and facilitates these new things to happen. Then my real work in civil life is dealing with spectrum, so this is why I'm handling also this spectrum in my presentation. 5G is also partly created because of the idea of getting new spectrum for mobile communication. And it's already seen that 5G will require different frequency bands in order to fulfill all these planned capabilities and ideas what should be done using 5G. Of course, we need to be always connected, and we need to have continuous coverage everywhere. This means that we need to have low frequencies below 2 gigahertz, maybe also below 1 gigahertz, as we already have this IMT spectrum available in order to support this connected everywhere type of things. You cannot really provide these ultra high data rates with these low frequency bands because the spectrum is limited to maximum about 2 times 20 megahertz per operator. So you cannot really provide this ultra wideband things there, but low latency will be available when 5G is implemented on those bands. Then this medium frequencies, which is now around 3 gigahertz, this band is already planned for mobile communication, and it will be the real starting band for 5G, and it will have the possibility to give operators about 80 to 100 megahertz, which is needed in order to really create some kind of 5G experience in data speeds. Then the new thing is this high frequencies, about 20 gigahertz, and there you can really have a possibility for extremely high peak data rates, like more than 1 gigabit per user. The thing is that there you should have a possibility to get 1 gigahertz per operator, which then facilitates these very, very high data rates. But then, of course, this is not the coverage band, and it's not likely that these data rates will be available everywhere. So it is assumed that they will only be available in city areas and this type of hotspots, at least in the beginning, but who knows. Next year there will be World Radio Communication Conference, which will decide this new spectrum, and the new spectrum is now this millimeter waves above 20 gigahertz. You can see here the bands which are under discussion. Some of them are more potential, like 26 gigahertz, which is already nominated as a pioneering band in Europe, so I think this will happen in any case. Then there are other very likely bands around 40 gigahertz and 50 gigahertz, maybe also something around 70 gigahertz. 70 gigahertz sounds a quite high spectrum, but maybe it happens, and of course, if you have this very small area type of things, then that could be useful there. And then, of course, if you can get very high bandwidth per operator, then it would help in this very high bitrate services also. TSA supports identification of as many bands as possible here, but we know that some of the bands are not really under discussion anymore. Then the third element is this specifications, and all the European IMT bands have already been specified also for 5G. So this means that operators can evolve to 5G technology based on their business plans and provided that equipment are available. So there is always, in this equipment availability, there is always this chicken and egg problem, that there needs to be serious business plans before suppliers start to make equipment. So this is also valid in these millimeter waves where 3GPP, they have now specified these 4 bands. There's 26 specified, and two band plans for 28, which will not be identified in WRC, but some countries will in any case or have plans to introduce 5G there, and then this 30 gigahertz band. This operators' serious plans is especially needed in this 26 gigahertz band to happen, because now it seems that the regulatory framework in Europe, it starts to be quite ready, and so the regulators have done their part quite well, but before it's licensed to operators, then I don't think that suppliers will do very much, because everybody is concentrating now on 28 gigahertz, where the real implementations will happen in a very near future. So if I can wish something, it is really that this 26 gigahertz band will be licensed as whole as soon as possible in order to make this ecosystem to happen as soon as possible. Then that was all that I planned to say. So basically there are these cornerstones, this very high bit rates, ultra low latency and massive machine type of communication. Then there will be spectrum, hopefully new spectrum in millimeter waves, and then the specifications in place. So I think that there are elements that 5G will happen, although it may be so that the users, they will not recognize when the LTE has changed to 5G in the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now the next speaker, Trevor, Gill, who will be giving us a view from DCMS, which will be very welcome.
Good afternoon. I'm Trevor Gill. My background, although I'm now working part-time in DCMS, is a career spent seeing the industry through every single generation from the beginning in Rakel and then Vodafone, which included starting with the time when just 6 of us were deciding what the analog network would be, and then seeing it through those 10-year steps that Dritan pointed out. So it's interesting to still be here with the 5th generation, but coming at it from a slightly different angle. So what's the killer app for 5G? Why are we bothering? Should we build it and they will come? Or do we need a desperate application to drive what it is we're going to build? Which way round is it? Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? And why did SMS beat the hype cycle? These and many other questions I may or may not answer in the next few minutes. But I'll have a go at some of them. So I'm talking about the 5G testbed and trials program. So DCMS is running this program, which started off with an announcement in the budget, in the autumn budget in 2016. I think at that point it was 150 million. There's also been some more money for other broadband initiatives. So there's quite a lot of money to put into trying to get the 5G ecosystem going for the benefit of Britain. And that's what we're trying to do. So what are the objectives? Establishing the UK as a leading player in that marketplace one way or another, and cultivating the ecosystem we've talked about, getting people working together, small companies, large companies, operators, users, to get the best out of 5G. So two things that does. That gets new business opportunities within 5G for British businesses and new revenues for British businesses, but also to accelerate getting production networks deployed so that the whole community in the UK can enjoy the benefits of having that connectivity that we're all used to and getting the productivity gains coming from that. So that's what we're trying to achieve. Somebody earlier on criticised the government for putting money into things too late in the game. In the case that we're talking about artificial intelligence, I'd like to remind him that the very first collaborative project with multiple organisations working together was funded by the government. It was called the ALVI programme, and it was 30 years ago, and it was an artificial intelligence project. Well, one of the large-scale demonstrators was an artificial intelligence project to develop a speech recognition system. We heard about one that actually works this afternoon, so it's taken 30 years to get there. But was government money too early or too late? Well, we shall see with this one. So just a quick quote from Margot James, the Minister. It's a huge opportunity for Britain to make a difference and become a world leader in 5G. So what have we done so far? There's a universities test network. That's the University of Surrey, Bristol, and King's College London working together. And they've, between them, achieved several world firsts, including testing the first applications over an end-to-end all 5G new radio and 5G core network. That was the first thing that was funded by the programme. Since then, we've had half a dozen projects which we've called Phase 1. These projects are all running in this current financial year, from April this year through to March next year. And it's a very interesting mix of different things. We've taken a fairly broad definition of what 5G should be. So there are two projects that are about rural connectivity and rural applications, farming, tourism, connectivity to difficult to reach areas. Some of that being done with not 5G standard technologies, but with some innovative alternative solutions that are suitable for that environment. We've got a testbed in Liverpool where we're building a millimetre wave fixed wireless access network in part of Liverpool, and they're trialling a whole load of interesting health and social care activities. In Worcestershire, we're trying out some of those Industry 4.0 that you've heard about applications with a real manufacturer who wants to get the benefits of 5G to see if that's going to work for him, including some virtual reality for help, or artificial augmented reality to help in maintaining equipment. We've got a smart tourism project in Bath and Bristol, also doing some augmented reality, and we've got a development of some small cells and a dense network of both microwave and 3.5 gigahertz 5G new radio in a vehicle testing test track to look at connected autonomous vehicles. So a whole range of interesting things there, relatively short term, most of which will come to an end. They may have follow-ons. But the next step is we've also got a couple of things going on in road and rail. There's a feasibility study to look at demands and infrastructure for road coverage, looking at whether some of the infrastructure that Highways England has can be used to help to roll out road coverage, and some work at National Network Rail's Innovation Centre and on the Transpennine route to look at improving coverage to trains. The big focus right now is a project called Urban Connected Communities, and that is aiming to produce a real sustainable testbed that doesn't end at the end of the couple of years it's going to last, but that leads into production and looks at commercializing applications. And the first step is to choose the city. That's been going on over the last few weeks, and we had a large amount of interest. There's a short list of cities been drawn up, and they learned who they were last week. And quite soon, in a few weeks' time, we'll be announcing the one city that's been chosen to build this testbed. And then there'll be a process. We also had a number of events with industry to discuss with industry how this should work. And work out what we're going to do next. But the aim is to develop the ecosystem, to get some early rollout, to test deployment models, and to try and bust some of the barriers of, if you've got a really enthusiastic local authority, we ought to be able to stop having problems with planning applications causing, try and get rid of some of the problems of getting stuff rolled out, to get it rolled out quickly, to find out if it really makes a difference if you roll out a 5G infrastructure, looking at IoT applications as well as broadband, and applications both in managing the city and in commercial applications. So the aim is to get a whole ecosystem of organizations together to both build coverage and try things out. Is it build it and they will come, or is it find the application first? It's trying to put those two together and find out what works, and everybody gets a chance to learn, find out how to build it, find out if it works if you've built it, and to inform policy and regulation. Coming on soon behind it, there will be a rural connected communities project. The details of that are yet to be announced, but it's very clear that there will be a rural project to follow on from the urban one. One thing I haven't mentioned so far, but again touched on earlier on, the comment made about the S in NB-IOT, or S in IoT is the security bit. Security is actually important within this, and there's a separate project working with the National Cybersecurity Centre, working out how to address some of the issues of security in 5G, and all of the phase 1 projects, we're asking questions about security of the participants to make sure they haven't forgotten it all the way along. And the final thing that is being funded is a thing called UK 5G. I probably don't need to tell you very much about that, because you've probably heard quite a lot about that already today. And at that point, I will finish.
Thank you, Trevor. Thank you, Trevor. So clearly some real things happening there. Dean, welcome to the stage. Some of you will have seen Dean's already been tweeting his views. Look forward to hearing the latest thinking.
Thank you very much, Simon. So, thank you. I'm the last speaker on the panel before we go to the sitting down part of this session. My pseudonym, if you like, is Disruptive Dean, or at least that's my Twitter handle. And so I'm here as the token curmudgeon, who's going to be, well, I'm perhaps not going to be quite as negative as some people are on 5G, and I'm not going to be as negative as I am on certain other things. But I do want to perhaps sort of inject a sort of a note of skepticism and perhaps a hashtag of 5G jag. And I don't mean a self-driving F-type, but is it maybe just another G rather than something special? So I'm an analyst and futurist, and I primarily cover mobile and wireless, but I also do a lot of other technology areas like sort of voice and video communications, aspects of IoT, blockchain, and AI. And what I've been looking at is some of the issues of 5G that result from what I will call lobbying asymmetry. And I think that we can probably all agree that the industry, the mobile industry, has done a remarkable job in raising the profile of 5G, to the extent that 5G now has taken over in policy circles from the word digital as being the buzzword du jour. It's basically evolved from, with ever shorter terms, from information superhighway in the 1990s. And we're now down to sort of 2 letters, so I'm not quite sure what the next one is. So one of the things I would like to do is to sort of cut through and just point out that it's not the only thing going on in wireless. Now, first off, I should say I am trying to put a 6-dimensional hypercube on a two-dimensional screen here, so apologies if this is slightly confusing. What I want to point out is that for the wireless industry and the wireless use cases have many, many dimensions, whether that's speed, whether that's range, whether how important it is as the thing you're connecting. We'll talk about verticals in a minute. Coverage is a huge issue. I walked into this building today and I had 1 bar of 3G, not even 4G. And so we can start thinking about whether this idea of ubiquitous 5G and the applications that might need it is likely to be realistic. And the other thing I'd like to draw your attention to is this dotted line axis of business model. The assumption from the cellular industry is that mobile is primarily driven by national large operators. So in the UK we have 4, other countries have between 2 and 5. That is not necessarily something that's going to hold true in future. And interestingly, one of the things that 5G appears to be doing, when people talk about 5G being transformative, the first industry that's going to get transformed is the mobile industry itself. And we're going to start to see a lot of other models of people who own and build networks. Not just sort of mobile virtual operators, as you see today selling services, but we'll see more private networks, we might see government, we'll see networks provided as amenities, and perhaps in the long-term future, decentralized versions as well. There's a couple of companies that are trying to blend blockchain and distributed ledgers with wireless connectivity. But one thing I would also say here is 5G is not the only game in town. The Wi-Fi industry isn't quite as large as cellular. So we heard earlier that cellular is $3.5 trillion contribution to GDP. Wi-Fi, the only numbers I've seen are for the US only, and that's $500 billion in the US, so probably triple that, maybe 1.5 trillion globally. So that is also a significant component of the wireless firmament, and there's an increasing amount of innovation that's going on there. Do not believe it when people who say that, oh, well, Wi-Fi will be part of 5G. It's 2 very large circles with a very, very narrow overlap. Whilst you can have Wi-Fi access into a 5G network, 99-point-something% of Wi-Fi will have absolutely nothing to do with cellular. It will be for homes, for offices, perhaps public spaces, locations like this, with limited or zero integration. And that's going on its own R&D and innovation path. So there's new standards, they always basically refer to it as AX or AD and so forth. New spectrum, ability to have greater and more dense usage. It's going to be an interesting set of opportunities. And if you speak to Wi-Fi vendors, particularly in building, they are several years ahead of anything in cellular. They're talking about volumetric coverage rather than area. They're trying to do things like motion sensing with Wi-Fi through walls, all sorts of clever stuff, and also linking it with AI, courtesy of the Googles of this world. So this term ubiquitous 5G comes up quite a lot, and it's a really important one because unless and until 5G becomes, well, maybe not absolutely everywhere, but at least most places the world becomes 5G primary, there's no point really in developing a 5G application or 5G device if it's only ever going to work 70% of the time. And a particular thing I'll mention is indoor coverage, which, as I've said already, even with 3G and 4G is problematic. This building is partly below ground or in a dip. We've probably absolutely impeccable environmental credentials, which means it's got metal-backed foil insulation, probably in the walls. It's probably got really nice reflective glass, which essentially turns it into a Faraday cage. There's about 1 million buildings around the world which have distributed antenna systems, dedicated indoor systems, which provide, in theory, good coverage in hotels or airports or office buildings. About 1 million, give or take. Most of those, we just heard the spectrum presentation, most of those systems indoors at the moment don't work above 2.5 gigahertz. And yet the main bands for 5G we're expecting, certainly for capacity, are 3.5 and millimeter wave. And there is no way we are going to be reinventing the world's indoor coverage systems in every country around the world, or even the UK, anytime soon. Those are incredibly difficult projects. There's a limited capacity that the operators have. There's a limited willingness of building owners to invest in them. That is going to be a decade-long project or more. which essentially means that we will find that 5G is going to be patchy. It will be very good some places and utterly absent others. And that has a huge implication if you're an application developer. And what it will mean is that application and device developers will need fallback strategies ubiquitously. They will need to work around limitations in the network. It will be some time before they can assume 5G. The other thing we talk about a lot is verticals. And it's worth saying that whilst there is a lot of interest in many industries around wireless connectivity, the more they become dependent on wireless, the more it turns out they have unique requirements, which aren't necessarily satisfied either by one technology or one ownership and business model. So the electricity industry is a good one. You might think the high voltage grid is an absolute opportunity for 5G. And maybe it is. But the point that's been made to me by people in that sector is if they're dependent on the 5G network and the 5G network is dependent on their electricity, there might be a problem unless you have diesel backup everywhere. So maybe they would like to say, can you give us our spectrum and we'll manage it ourselves in a sort of critical infrastructure sort of way. And you get other requirements. The economics of rural areas are complicated. Manufacturing, arc welding blasts out RF interference on various bands that people don't necessarily know about. You have all sorts of complexities, which frankly the world's mobile operators don't really want to have to do. I don't think the legal departments of most telcos will want to support this mythical robotic surgery application for 20 quid a month for an IoT device. I suspect the legal department is going to be, yeah, you know what, leave it to Philips, leave it to GE, leave it to someone else. So I think there's going to be new players that act as like industrial mobile operators, for example. So we'll probably come on to some of this. I'm not going to go through all these points, but we talk a lot about things like edge computing gets mentioned in 5G, network slicing, possibly. I think when I speak to people in the data center industry, what an edge device looks like, edge computing looks like, it looks like a 40-foot shipping container with 5 racks of equipment. It doesn't look like a 30-watt micro server at a cell site. And if you actually look at where the gigawatts of compute are going to go, there simply isn't enough electricity to get to more than a couple of % of the world compute resource at cell towers unless you give them generators or wire them into the grid with a lot more power than they have today. I think we'll probably come on to that. Interesting thing I'll throw out there is it looks like for certain aspects of 5G there are prerequisites for service providers to have done before they can really make 5G networks that scale. One of those is software-defined networks. And another one is probably various forms of AI for automation, particularly if you've got millions of small cells or millions of network slices. So if you then have to say you need to have a really good SDN competence and a really good AI competence, otherwise, frankly, this thing is not going to get to large scale. And you ask how many telcos are there, you get to an answer of about 3. That probably, maybe it might be AT&T, it might be Verizon, it might be China Mobile, it might be NTT Docomo and a couple of others in Asia. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in the background before you even get to the radio part. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean. Could I ask all the presenters to join the seated area, please? Now, I scribbled down some notes, but I know the crowd here like to throw in opinions as soon as possible, so I am going to look up from my notes and ask for hands so I can get a feel if there's anyone who'd like to. Oh, okay, I can see a hand there. All right, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to go straight to the audience and just start because we wanted to finish on time. We've got about 15 minutes left and I'd like to just get a discussion and reaction. So there's somebody put their hand up over there. If we could just let us know who we're speaking to.
My name is Slavomir Pietrzyk. I'm representing IS Wireless. We are a very small SME participating in Horizon and FP7 projects and working on software-defined RAN. And I wanted to ask you about, one thing about 5G, because there are various definitions of 5G, and we all know those KPIs, wonderful KPIs. which to me, all of them boil down to larger capacity, to higher capacity expressed in those bits per second per hertz per square meter. So that's a densification, significant densification of radio network that cannot be done in other way, but just by installing much smaller cells, much more ubiquitous number of cells and small base stations around us. Now, to have them ubiquitous, we need to have them low cost. That means we should consider virtualization of the radio access network. But virtualization comes quite nicely with slicing, of course, which we need for other purposes. Now, this whole picture is applicable to what we see as 5G and 4G. And to me is more a differentiator of, let's say, the network of the future, rather than just being glued to the 5G. And we are decomposing functionalities, breaking up the monolithical models, the existing models, which seem to be quite much protected by the big players nowadays. Because without breaking them up, we would end up in a similar situation as a car industry 100 years ago, when car manufacturer does everything from the scratch. Now, what do you think, and here is the question, what do you think would be the role of those big players in the future? I mean, big operators and big vendors.
In terms of opening up the ecosystem,
yeah, and
for smaller innovation,
playing
within the network infrastructure.
Exactly, playing in this environment.
That is definitely one of the hype things around 5G, opening up the infrastructure. Are we buying into that?
In part. I think that, particularly in the early days, the first 5G networks are almost certainly going to be, if not single vendor, but a few large vendors, because they're going to need extensive customization. They'll need large resources of engineers, which you're not going to get from a host of smaller companies or the open source community. They're going to need feet on the ground. Maybe when we get further down that experience curve, and it's sort of, there's 50 networks up and running around the world, and we're then maybe building and scaling the existing ones, perhaps. But I think that, we can argue about which large vendors become more important or less important, but I don't see them going away.
Any other views on that?
I mean, it's generally a game in which everybody wants to have a tilt at the big players and try and take a slice of their lunch for perfectly obvious reasons. And you can see that last week, Vodafone and Telefonica both announced that they were going to trial an open RAN system, aiming to try to commoditize the RAN to take a tilt at the Nokias of this world. So everybody has a go. How much it will actually happen, I think, like all these things, there's never a revolution. These things happen slowly, but generally, I'm not saying the big players have got it easy for life. It's challenging for everybody. It's challenging for big operators. It's challenging for big manufacturers. And there are opportunities for small players, and there always will be. Whether it will revolutionize it, wait and see.
And I know that Nokia is quite open in terms of saying they're supporting Open RAN and all these initiatives around opening up the platforms.
Yes, I think we are.
It's a real thing. It's making does it bring value to Nokia to have that open platform?
I think that it brings value, but I agree that these big operators, they will lead and make the ecosystem, and then everybody will benefit it after it's there, because it's kind of impossible to get equipment if there are no big operators also implementing the same band.
I think it's probably, going back to what Dean said earlier in his presentation, we tend to forget that the fundamental capability for innovation, technology innovation that the mobile industry itself has, and we rightfully sort of point out to the needs on a 5th generation, 35-year-old mobile ecosystem, mobile industry, for the need for it to effectively innovate itself. And potentially, the 5G especially, exactly because by opening up away from the point where you need national coverage, and by definition, big players with big pockets, with big backers, with big vendors that have the necessary expertise, then you will probably start to see that for bespoke solutions, for in-building cellular solutions, the same way that in the UK, and I'm sure Slavomir, the same examples across Europe, There are plenty of companies that are infrastructure companies that they don't care necessarily what kind of the technology they will deploy if they have the necessary technical expertise to deploy it. So I don't see any reason why in 4 years' time or in 3 years' time there wouldn't be a cellular installation company that will effectively be able to take the shard and say, we will provide an indoor cellular solution for you specifically, and then they will need to enter into agreement. The key thing for making that happen, though, which is why I push it for 2 to 4 years in the future, is that it is the equivalent, and we discussed with Simon earlier, it is the equivalent of pushing for new builders to come when there is no land available, i.e. no spectrum. And that is where the regulation element comes in, and that requires, again, time to effectively sort out. But I definitely see that kind of thing happening, where the softwarization will lower the price point for investment. The size of the installations will also be smaller, which also requires agility in the installation in order to go to different environments, and that definitely will need to happen.
I saw two hands. It's a bit of maybe Howard. Just in the...
Sorry.
Thank you. It's Howard Ben again. First of all, thank you for reminding me about our Emirates debate and how I lost that debate. However, it does remind me that I should let everyone here know, of course, that in San Diego 2 weeks ago when we approved the Release 15 standards, LTE and its evolution in Release 15, along with NR, New Radio, are both 5G.
Yes.
So we have a 5G standard, and the
Constructive
LTE
ambiguity.
variety of it is 5G, so I'm sure I will end up winning. Anyway, my question. Spectrum. We heard in Anne's presentation about the 26 gigahertz band. In the UK in particular, we seem to be a little bit behind most other countries. Ofcom still haven't even set a date for when they're considering to auction that frequency band. Do the panel think that that is going to inhibit the UK in rollout of these new technologies?
No. And I also think that potentially the auctions don't look the same way that they do elsewhere or for the other bands. I mean, there's an argument which says that for a lot of those bands, you could maybe have them lightly licensed, because ultimately, how are you going to tell if anyone uses 26 gigahertz in their own building? You're never going to know, because it's not going to get outside. So unless you actually have someone visiting every location. And actually, to be fair, even I had someone from GSMA tacitly recognise that on a Spectrum event panel a couple of weeks ago. So I think we might, maybe, I don't know if people from Ofcom here, maybe we'll see something a little bit more innovative on that, and also hopefully on 3.8 to 4.2.
I think something that might drive that kind of thing anyway is there are lots of innovators out there looking to do things in the license exempt band at 60 gigahertz, yes, which are not dissimilar to what you can do with 5G at 28. So they may not be exactly the same, but you'll see people out there trying that in the short term, and that'll prime the pump if nothing else.
Well, I think that it may be unlikely that 26 could be license exempt or lightly licensed because of this existing compatibility problems with the satellite service below 24 gigahertz. So this is why it has been announced earlier that this should be licensed, and nowadays, unfortunately, it usually means auctioned.
Just any strong views on Spectrum?
I tend not to touch Spectrum if I can avoid.
Well, I think that's an indication. I think that what I found positive around 5G is there's definitely a renewed enthusiasm for sharing of Spectrum and thinking about that, whether that's truly a 5G or whether it's something that's happening on the side. But actually, that's and private networks that can use bits of Spectrum. Looks interesting as a thing that's happening in the rising tide of 5G.
It is, but the question was probably, if I understood Howard well, was specifically for the 3.4 to 3.8. And it is very interesting to see if the next round of the Spectrum auction, which is announced for next year, if that will happen with the same speed, because that potentially should indicate on what is the direction of travel for 3.8 to 4.2. Space as well. But will it hinder? If you believe what the mobile network operators are saying, and from my perspective, there is no reason not to. They all have their road maps to 5G, including EE, BT, and Vodafone announcements, and the most recent one was 3 on the 7th of June. So they have very, very clear plans, but it seems that it will be the same road as before, demand-driven deployment.
There's also all the politics around 28 as well. Yeah. Which we're not going to get into here, and sort of World Radio Congress and where that fits, but yeah.
Murray Romney, formerly of Keysight. Yeah, I'd like to congratulate Dean on getting 1 bar of 3G. Because yesterday I just took possession of this brand new Samsung S9 Plus, which according to the website is the best smartphone in the world, and on Vodafone I got 0 bars of 2G and had great difficulty sending a text message earlier. And I'm wondering who's to blame for that. I'm not saying any individual company, but I think
it's the thing with Cambridge Wireless. I remember coming to a previous Cambridge Wireless event at an ARM office near here, and that was a Faraday cage, as far as I could tell.
There was a problem many years ago. I don't know if it still applies this far away, and I looked up this morning to see how far away it is, but there is certain sensitivity about a place called Lord's Bridge near here, where they have radio telescopes, and that has inhibited the Cambridge area. Somebody locally may be able to tell me if that's true any longer. It certainly was some years ago.
So I've interrupted you.
That's okay. Anyway, so my point is that everybody's focusing on what can UK do to be a leader in 5G. I think one of the things that's frustrated me, spending the last 20 years in standards, watching what's been done to the technology, which in many ways we've pushed the peaks at the detriment of the average, and that I mean the fact that we have no standards on the antennas for 4G phones is something that the EU has suddenly realised and may well create a stink about. But my point is that I'd like the panel's views on the difference between focusing on making the UK a leader in 5G versus focusing on outcomes, which is what is the most efficient way for the UK to invest in the provision of wireless services to make the UK successful, rather than focusing on this latest, G. Because I think we're kind of missing the point. If you actually look at the spectral efficiency of what we're doing, then Release 7, 2007, was pretty damn good with 5 megahertz of spectrum. And here we are talking about hundreds of megahertz, and talking about new bands and new everything, and yet we can't afford to deploy even a basic network in one of the world's centers of technology and Welcome. So can you discuss this? Why are we talking about 5G rather than putting our money where we need to invest to make things successful for the lowest investment cost?
I'll ask you to be relatively quick with your answers. We're coming towards the end, but Dritan, over to you. You were jumping.
You
a
asked
bit
the wrong one for a short answer. I will tend to agree with you, but an academic approach to your question is to define what successful means. So there is a race on 5G for good or bad reasons. And the government ambition is that for the UK will be a leader in 5G. And the key question for the UK ecosystem in particular, which all are grappling with, is what does that mean? What is the leader? And the leader fundamentally means earlier, meaningful adoption of the technology. And how do you identify this meaningfulness? Because 5G will happen with or without the UK. So if you go for a 4G coverage, which we will have in the next, we shouldn't forget that the UK started, so if we work on 10-year cycles, UK started in 2012, rolling out. We are only 6 years later on the 4G. So even looking at a 10-year cycle, we still need to look forward to 2022 for a full replacement. We are talking about an earlier deployment of 5G where it is meaningful. And I think what the UK has decided to do, it appears this is a consensus, is a market-driven, demand-driven deployment. And that makes sense for enhanced mobile broadband, which is release 15. And we have another 2 to 4 years to effectively identify what and where is meaningful for 5G to be deployed. Not because it is 5G and it is shiny, but because it opens opportunities that do not exist today with the existing technology, with 4G. So that is where I will see this taking into the future, and that's why we are talking in parallel with all of the coverage. O2 says publicly they are investing 2 million every day for improving the coverage in the UK. So that makes it 700 million a year. Money is going into improving 4G. So let's focus on where 5G will be meaningful and prepare for the adoption for the next G. Let's hope that it is not 6.1.
Okay, if I can say something. So the government can basically, there are limited things that they can do. They can give spectrum available and then they can maybe finance something. But it's difficult to impact on the demand because the demand is one that makes things happen. But maybe one thing is that to make 26 gigahertz available first, like for 5 years for operators without auctions, so that and operators and also other interested parties, so that and maybe have some kind of incentives that if you implement there and make network there, so that the technology would come and people get experience of real 5G. So this kind of things could maybe help.
Just one thing to say from my corner is that you may see 5G as the main thrust of government. It isn't the only one. There's a thing going on at the moment called the Future Telecoms Infrastructure Review, which I've had nothing whatever to do with, so can't tell you anything about what it's concluding, but it is addressing that broader question of how we get the right telecoms infrastructure for the UK for the future. And should be published not too far away, I believe.
I just said, first off, there's no race to 5G. It's a myth. It's a nice media story. And I would say that government likes the story about 5G. It's a nice thing to stand up in Westminster to talk about. But frankly, it just means new wireless stuff. And whether you put Wi-Fi or 4G or piece of wet string, doesn't matter because it sounds like it's new and shiny.
So I'm a little bit over time. I'm going to nod that I'm allowed. William, you had your hand up. Are you still happy to have you? William chaired last year's 5G debate, so maybe your question could be the last question for this session.
So actually I wanted to pick up on the indoor coverage, which I think Dean made very well and clearly we're experiencing here. So all the data shows that about 80% of mobile usage is indoors and growing. I've seen recent surveys that say that half of all employees are unable to make good cellular calls inside their building and they believe that's the detriment to their business. Surely that's the key thing we need to fix, and yet 5G seems to have nothing in its armoury that brings any particular benefit to improving in-building coverage, unless you expand it to Wi-Fi, which as Dean rightly said, is expanding its capabilities there. So shouldn't we actually concentrate a lot more on sorting out some sort of Wi-Fi in-building integration rather than worrying about millimetre wave 5G or something like that?
I think there's a lot in that, but on the other hand, there is the other aspect of the fact that some people discover that Wi-Fi in buildings doesn't work awfully well. In fact, in our own building, as William will know, it doesn't work very well. And people are actually, I hear from the US, very interested in using the CBRS spectrum to deploy 5G as a more reliable, in-building, well-engineered solution, which it may well turn out to be. So there are lots of interesting ways of approaching that, and 4G, 5G may turn... there are already small cell products that can do 4G and support multiple operators or whatever, and there are CBRS type things in the US. I think time will shake out. Clearly, the distributed antenna system is the most ridiculous piece of engineering you could ever invent to solve a very real commercial problem, and there are better ways to solve it in the future with multi-operator small cells.
There's a fundamental problem, though, of public services on private property. And it's very difficult for governments to incentivize private property owners without actually giving them money to do coverage in buildings like this. Now, the question is the answer about having the public services on private property? Is there or is the answer to not just confine ourselves to talking about wireless as a service? You can deliver a wireless capability as a service, as owned infrastructure, as an amenity, free, as a decentralized system, as a community. We get hung up on this word service, and that's only one of many ways of delivering connectivity.
Thank you. I'm definitely going to bring it to a close there. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating, for questions here, and to the panel. Thank you.